Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us on another lovely Sunday afternoon. Well, I hope it's lovely where you are. It definitely is here in Brisbane. Thanks for joining us again. We've had a bit of a break, but we're back. And this week we're talking about food. So what is the link between our food systems and climate change? Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that we're all meeting on. For me, that's the Yagara and Turrbal peoples in this place, otherwise known as Brisbane, and I acknowledge that the land has never been ceded and that there is ongoing sovereignty of First Nations people across this country. Today with me, we have three amazing guests. So I don't know what order on the screen they are for you, but to my left, we have Associate Professor Carol Richards from, I wanted to call you Roberts then, Carol Richards from QUT. She's a sociologist who looks at food politics, and she's also very active in the Australian food sovereignty movement in Australia. So she's going to talk a little bit about that work. We also have Thomas King with us, who has set up an organisation called Food Frontier, and he's taken on the huge task of how do we change our diets to be more plant-based. And he's going to talk about some of the really interesting and exciting things that are happening in that space, which is great because I know there's been a lot of discussion on the 2040 Facebook page about veganism and meat and livestock and regenerative agriculture. So it's going to be great to talk to Thomas about some of those issues. And finally, we have Suzanne Thompson, who is a custodian of the Inangai peoples up in central Queensland, but she's also involved in the Australian Native Foods and Botanicals movement, and is going to talk about what we can learn from what Indigenous groups across Australia are doing around native foods and also looking after the land. So we're going to follow the same format as usual, and we're going to take our speakers one by one for about 10 minutes each. As you're listening in, please post your questions in the little question box so that we can keep track of what you're interested in. And after about half an hour, we'll hand over to your questions. So please send them in. All right, so we might start with Carol and get Susan and Thomas to turn off your cameras for us, just so we can focus a bit. So, Carol, let's open up with a big question. What is the link between food and climate change? How are food systems contributing to climate change?
That is the big question, Amanda. Yeah, there's so many ways to look at that, and I think to make it less complex, we can look at it in terms of different aspects of the food system and the way the food system is at the moment. So the kind that we have access to now is often referred to as an industrial food system. So that's big agriculture, big corporate ag. It's globalized. Food travels a long way around the world before it reaches our plates. And industrial agriculture is probably one of the most obvious places to start in terms of the link between food and climate change. So if you go back to almost the beginnings of it, that the amounts of land that's needed to grow food, it involves first of all kind of enclosures or access to land, which often involves removing populations from land, but then big programs of deforestation and tree clearing as well for room for large-scale monocultural cropping type enterprises. So at this stage, we've started to work against natural systems and start to disrupt the balance, the natural ecological system, the balance, and the way that carbon's captured in the land and the soil and the trees. So on top of that, you've got a system that relies on agricultural inputs, because once you've got a monoculture, all the insects turn up to have a bit of a party there. You hear about the locust swarms and so on. So we need pesticides, fertilizers and so on. So a lot of these agrochemical inputs are fossil fuel based as well. So this system has provided lots of cheap food for us, over a number of years since industrial agriculture, but there's also been costs associated with it. And we're seeing that now through having these conversations about climate change as well. So just probably the next stage of that as well is that we've got to move all of this food around the world. So again, fossil fuel dependent systems, globalized agriculture, food moving a long way. You even hear of prawns being shipped halfway around the world to be peeled and then sent back, those kinds of things. There's all these kind of weird little perversions in our food system that really doesn't help with climate change. We've got food waste as well. We think there's about 40% of food that's wasted, and food that's rotting in landfill is a big producer of methane. And that's quite a potent greenhouse gas, more so than carbon as well. So that's something we really need to be concerned about. And then I would also say that there's feedback loops, and not only are we affecting the climate by the way that we produce the food, but the way the climate's going to affect food production in the future. It is also going to send us into a bit of a downward spiral as well.
Mm. So it's also the way we're producing our food's also leading to a whole lot of food security issues in Australia. And I was quite shocked. I think it was only last year I found out that I think in Queensland it was something like 16% of households are actually food insecure.
Yeah.
So what's going on there in Australia around food insecurity?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting in a way that we can think of climate change as a global wicked problem that's difficult to solve. So too is food insecurity, and there's complex reasons for it, and there's many different reasons. But the type of food security that we see in Australia, it's not because we don't have enough food. It's we grow and export about 60% of our food. We produce much more food than we can eat. About 80% of our beef is exported,
Oh,
nearly all of our. So what's happening is there's plenty of food in the system, but the key reason that people are not having access to it now is they just literally don't have enough money in their pockets to buy the food. So it's quite a bizarre situation. So it's kind of, it happens alongside climate change, but it's also going to be more intertwined with climate change as we go on and we experience more shocks to the weather and our food systems. So at the moment, well, the government is not really collecting data on climate change because, on food insecurity, because the assumption is that that happens elsewhere, that we have lots of food. But there's a big confusion between access to food and actually being able to, the availability of food and the actual access to food as well. So if you think about some of the economic shocks that people have experienced in Australia around the growing housing prices, the cost of living, the growing energy prices, often the only flexible item left in a household budget is for food. So that's where people are cutting down. And we know about 5% are extremely food insecure in Australia, but the figure that people who are moderately food insecure, that means skipping meals and going without food still and on a regular basis, it's up to around 18% now. So that's,
wow.
we're looking almost, 1 in
One in
20.
five. Yeah.
Sorry, 1 in 5. Yeah, terrible maths on a Sunday. Yeah, that's quite, so that's quite significant. And
So why is
to
that?
address,
If we've got heaps of food, yeah,
yeah,
there's the cost of it, but why is cost an issue? What's causing that?
because the household expenses are generally increasing, so it's almost impossible for somebody in their 20s to buy a house now as they once did. People get locked into a cycle of renting forever. There's a lot of precarity in work. It's very hard to get ongoing, well-paid jobs. So we know a lot of people are engaging in a gig economy as well. So while everything's precarious about your housing and your income, it also makes your access to food precarious as
Mm.
well. So there's been an increased reliance on food banks and food
Mm.
relief, which ironically we waste so much food that there is food to go through those channels. But both problems need solving separately. We shouldn't have poverty in Australia with people who are working, and we shouldn't be wasting 40% of food as well.
Yeah, something that gets to me also about that sort of supermarket duopoly that happens. So a lot of the provision of that wasted food going from your Coles and Woolies to the food banks, when actually Coles and Woolies pricing and control of the food market is actually creating that problem as well. So it's that
Yeah,
loop that keeps that problem going.
yeah. Absolutely, yeah, we're trapped in a bit of a treadmill there. I think, like you say, it's like a causal loop. One of the things about the supermarkets is that they have up to 70 or 80% of market share just between Coles and Woolworths. So that's quite a concentrated market. And when the market's that concentrated, it's quite easy then to almost become a de facto government of how the food system is run. One of the things that the supermarkets like to do is to address the cosmetic appearance of food. So they have their very strict standards. And it could be the difference between 2 or 3 millimeters that makes an apple either available for sale or rejected for cow food. So we're wasting, we've been really frivolous with our food. We're wasting a lot without any real need, apart from that it looks good on the supermarket shelves and it's uniform and it looks cosmetically perfect, which isn't something that nature provides naturally. So you think of all the inputs, you know, the water inputs that goes into that in a country that's dry and getting drier and hotter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what's the way through? Because there's some really interesting ways that we're looking at rejigging the food system to become part of that solution around climate change, not just
Yeah.
the problem. So can you talk about some of the things that are happening that are helping fix that problem?
Yeah, I mean, there's been some amazing thinkers and doers in this space around the concepts of food system localization. So that's moving away from these big global industrial agriculture systems and trying to source food locally from small businesses or from family businesses or through co-ops and different ways of sharing food. And once you start doing that, then you're keeping the value in your local economy for that food. And plus, you know its provenance and who's grown it and where it's from as well. So it's not spinning around the world trying to find its way to your plate. It's usually the food miles, and hence the use of fossil fuels associated with those kinds of systems are fairly low. So they're becoming more and more popular. But it tends to be a grassroots movement. So it's a little bit fragmented, and you know, you really have to go out and seek alternatives. But that is one way to address it, is to look for those alternatives, do a little bit of research about where you can get food near you, who's involved, who's growing it, but also you know, start to grow some of your own food, I think, as well. Even if we can contribute a little to our own diets, you get that satisfaction of growing food and eating the food that you've grown. Kids learn where the food comes from, and adults for that matter. You know, we can attract pollinators into our gardens or balconies. And so there's lots of little things that can be done to make a difference there in producing your own food, but also some really clever things in the tech space, like apps for sharing food waste for compost. So there's one called Share Waste that I subscribe to, and so I leave some buckets in my driveway, and my neighbours just bring me their kitchen scraps, and I make compost and grow food. So there are little things that we can do at the local level, but I think probably one of the bigger things that we need to do is to keep the pressure on the politicians, because it's a grassroots movement. It needs more support, more funding, scaling, more involved, and the space and the land for this to happen as well. So I would say what we can do all of those nice things ourselves, but we need to keep the pressure on. We need to get to the climate march on the 20th of September, and we need to keep this visible and on the agenda, because we're being overlooked for big business everywhere, really. So yeah, that's my...
Yeah, is there a network that people can join that they can learn more about some of the food issues and stay in the loop?
Yeah, there's some really nice places, and again, they're grassroots movements in Australia. So there's the Australian Food Sovereignty Alliance. Their website be useful to look up. There's also something called the Right to Food Coalition, and it gives people an opportunity just to start to engage with these issues, even just to learn and have those conversations, or hopefully even to start getting involved. And again, with that, you know, a grassroots movement in trying to redefine the food system ourselves, but also putting pressure on where we need that pressure to make the way for it. You know, in terms of regulatory issues that stop people growing food on grass verges, for example, you know, we can do so much, but we've got this regulatory lock-in in other areas where we might be able to grow food, but we're not allowed to sell it, those kinds of things. So we need to engage on all levels, what we can do in our yard, but also at the highest political level as well. We need to be making a difference there if we can.
Yeah, that's the theme that's come through all of
Yeah,
the talk so far. It's like start where
right.
you are, but use that as a way to then start to learn more and get more involved politically at that local through the state and federal level. That's great. So Carol, we might leave you there for a moment, but we'll come back to questions for you in a sec. And I might
Okay.
get Thomas back in to get him to turn on his camera so we can see him. Hello. Oh, I think you're frozen, Thomas. Can you? No, you're good.
I'm
Thanks for
good.
joining us. Yep. Thanks for joining us, because I know you've got so much on at the moment. So can you tell us a little bit about Food Frontier and what you're trying to do?
Absolutely. So Food Frontier is Australia and New Zealand's independent think tank and industry accelerator for alternative proteins. So we know that there are many challenges facing our food system, and that our protein production and consumption is at the center of all of that. You know, we're going to have 10 billion people to feed within 30 years in the face of an increasingly volatile climate and dwindling natural resources and all the challenges that we're aware of. And meat consumption is expected to rise considerably in that time. In fact, consumption of animal-based foods is estimated by the World Economic Forum to increase up to 70% by mid-century. Wow. And already, you know, livestock occupy an enormous amount of global resources in terms of land, water, and so on. And so the question is, well, how do we tackle that challenge, knowing that meat holds complex social, cultural, and economic significance all around the world? You know, how do we tackle this? And there's been a whole range of different studies done that are illustrating the challenges we face in this respect. So the Eat Lancet, IPCC's recent report, Chatham House, all saying that we need to drastically reduce the production and consumption of meat, particularly consumption in developed Western countries where we're eating about 100 kilograms per person per year. But people love their sausages and burgers and meatballs. So what's interesting to see is this movement towards alternatives. As people are trying to reduce their meat consumption, they're seeking out alternatives to those products as they're becoming aware of the impact of meat, whether it be on their heart health or the climate or animal welfare. And so there are groups of chefs and scientists and entrepreneurs recreating our favorite foods using plants, or in the field of cellular agriculture, producing real meat, but by cultivating cells rather than farming entire animals. So wow. That's the space we're in here in Australia, is helping industry and government here understand these emerging sectors and the opportunities they present and how they can engage. Yeah.
Wow. So how is that received by business? Like, you know, is it seen as a big business opportunity at the moment, or is it still really at the beginning?
So I think this has really started to come on the radar of more businesses and investors and governments in the last sort of 12 months even. We've seen an enormous amount, several $1 billion invested in the meat alternative space globally. We've seen companies like Beyond Meat, which listed on the NASDAQ, skyrocket in terms of their IPO. Everyone from, you know, successful, well-known entrepreneurs like Richard Branson and Bill Gates, through to the biggest meat corporations, through to family foundations and agriculturalists investing in this space, because they recognize that we can't continue to rely only on livestock as the means of production for our food, and that it's causing a lot of challenges. And so if we can find ways to produce those foods that people love, but without having an animal in the middle of that equation, which is the factor that requires all these resources, most of which are used up on things like energy expenditure and the development of the skeletal system, and pollutes out the other end. If we can remove that from the equation by either going directly to plants or by feeding cells nutrients rather than filtering them through an animal, it's far more resource efficient. Because the reality is people don't eat meat because of how it's made. Most people eat it in spite of that. We enjoy meat because it tastes good, it's convenient, it holds cultural significance. And so this is about saying, well, how can we satisfy those factors people want in a meatball or a dumpling without those same adverse environmental and health consequences? And ultimately, I think a lot of these options are about offering stepping stones for people to just eat more plant-based foods.
Yeah, it's great. So, you know, there's been a lot of talk about veganism recently. Like, is veganism the answer? What's your take on that? Because it's got quite heated.
Yeah, look, there has been an increase in interest amongst people, I mean, reducing their meat consumption or eliminating it entirely. I think if someone wants to stop eating meat, power to them. But for a lot of people, that concept can be somewhat intimidating, I think, particularly if, like me, you grew up eating meat every day. Like I said, the average Australian still eats 100 kilograms of meat a year. And so to expect people to go from that to just, you know, beans and nuts and tofu I think is a confronting idea to some people. And plant-based food can be amazing and tasty and exciting and nutritious and filling. And, you know, I think we've started to break down some of those misconceptions people have about plant-based meals being, I don't know, boring or bland or unhealthy, you know, not nutritious. But still, for a lot of people, I think it's about those incremental steps. And so starting by reducing your meat consumption and exploring new meals and products and recipes and ways of eating and places to shop or eat, I think is a great place to start. But yeah, look, there's certainly sort of minorities at either end of that discussion that are, you know, quite passionate about their point of view. And I think you're always going to have that in any particular sort of social movement or form of disruption. I think what's important to recognize is that, you know, these new industries can be, you know, they present opportunities across the entire value chain. We just released a report at Food Frontier, which presented figures from the first ever economic modelling done on the size and impact of a plant-based meat sector on a national economy. So we engaged Deloitte. Wow. They looked at the current market in Australia, said it's worth about 150 million in consumer expenditure, but that within about 10 years, it could easily be 3 billion. And so we spoke as part of that evolution about the opportunities, for example, for Australian farmers to capitalise, whether it be farmers who were already growing crops like legumes that could redirect some of that produce into this high value supply chain, or farmers who mightn't yet be producing those sorts of agricultural products and that could diversify. And farmers love crops like legumes because they're nitrogen fixing, so they improve soil health. So yeah, I think we certainly approach this conversation through an opportunities lens and an empathetic lens, understanding where people are coming from rather than trying to, you know, shut one another down.
Yeah, that's great. So it's a bit of a stepping stone for a lot of people. Great. Okay. I'm sure there's going to be heaps of questions for you when we get to the questions. Suzanne, can we get your camera back on, please? So we can have a chat to you. Uh-oh. Tech strikes again. See, the camera's coming on and the microphone's coming on. Aha, you're here. Great.
Are we back?
We're back. Sorry, everybody. I'm still getting the hang of this program. So, Suzanne, it's been so great to meet you recently. So we've had Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have been living on this continent for a really, really long time, at least 60,000 years, but probably hundreds of thousands of years. And that knowledge around how to live in this place has weathered ice ages, like I think 3 ice ages in that time. And a lot of that knowledge is still being practiced across Australia. Can you talk to us a little bit from the groups that you've been working with and what you know about what Indigenous groups across the country are doing to help mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change?
Absolutely. Firstly, though, I'd like just to say Mikini Biddle, and it's a good day today. And also acknowledge my ancestors of the Inangi country out here in central Western Queensland where I'm sitting. And you're right, so absolutely, for many a millennia, Aboriginal people across Australia, you know, we have found ways of surviving. You know, we've survived through ice ages, you know, droughts. We've continually survived in the land. So what I'm finding as I go across, you know, and connecting with different mobs and different agencies that are really looking at, you know, where we're at, what's happening with our climate, you know, what's happened with our land, and spaces like that we live in, is that so Indigenous people are really starting to engage in carbon farming. We're also starting to look at native food production, and it's interesting because one of the things that I know for us locally here a few years ago, because we're in drought out here in outback central Queensland, and have been for quite some time, and I presented at a garden expo, you know, in the middle of this drought, around a bush tucker talk, and I went out to the town common, over 500 metres out of town, and I came back in and I presented them with 28 different specimens of harvested native foods and medicines. And so for that, though, and that was such a big learning for our local people here, in particular our landholders, you know, and I said, well, we're only in drought for cattle and sheep, you know, so, but as far as for our people, this was 70% of our diet. And, you know, even with what Thomas is talking about with Food Frontier, yes, we traditionally ate meat, but it wasn't, you know, it wasn't the largest part of our diet. It was how we, in harmony, because we all had responsibilities when it came to our totems, and why we had those song lines and those laws, because of protecting, so how we sustained ourselves as a race for the many millennia, you know, the tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years that we potentially did walk this country. So the native foods industry is really starting to pick up, and it's a rapidly growing industry. And I think one of those things is, you know, well, if it was evident for me to be able to go and harvest what I did in that length of time, and I think that it's starting to lead and provide the balance of land management and how we can start to care for this country, because our Australian, you know, bushlands and the particular plant species and things, we need those, you know, as far as, you know, with the management of our land, with erosion, you know, with the soil, you know, all these sorts of impacts that we're finding. And I think that's probably why we never had hoofed animals as well, because it's the impact of what hoofed animals are actually doing to our country. So what we're finding lots of different Indigenous groups across Australia that are really getting into the Kakadu plum industry. Is quite big now. Wattle seed is a large industry. You know, there's our native bush tomatoes, got the mountain pepper. You know, we've also got, you know, the rye berries. And we find also in when it comes to the regeneration back of mine sites and those sorts of places, that the collection of our native seeds and things, because of the importance of putting back into the soil those, you know, particular plant species that, you know, come from those areas and stuff. And, you know, and if we're still able to produce without any water, I think it speaks volumes, Amanda, absolutely.
Yeah, there's so much to learn. And I mean, what really struck me talking to you the other day is the generosity of so many groups, as well as being ready to share that information with non-Indigenous Australians who are now starting to listen a lot more, because we have to, because the feedback loop that create not just climate change, but there's been so many other environmental warnings that have been coming in. It's a really interesting time, but incredibly generous of First Nations groups to come to the table.
And it's a bit of a scary time too, I think, because there's a whole lot of shifts as Australia, in particular, how Aboriginal Australia, or first, you know, we've been perceived over, you know, the last 230 years, and, you know, and so we're really starting to step up into that space of, you know, I suppose being appreciated for the knowledge that we can share. But especially when it does come though to the native foods, and also, you know, some of the medicinal knowledge that we hold as scientists, and as clever scientists as we did for those many, you know, thousands of generations before us, was that, you know, there's that shared benefit. And I know that in Australia, and, you know, and this is about, it was interesting, Carol saying before about the grassroots movement, and we need to start to make a bit more of an impact, especially with the decision makers. And hopefully one day we will have true leaders in that space to be brave enough to step up and to embrace, you know, the past, but also the knowledge. But I know the Australian government with the Nagoya Protocol, and that's that shared benefit, access benefit agreement stuff. So, and FAB, who I'm very proud to be chairing, and also co-chairing with Amanda Garner, you know, is very mindful of that. And one of the things that we're ensuring is that we are looking at sustainable development of the sector, and also how we support that ethical engagement with our traditional owners, and how we facilitate, you know, the research and innovation in that space. So, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because that's the challenge. I think it's come up a few times in some of the discussions, like, if we see the challenge of climate change just as a technical issue, we can actually inadvertently set up the same extractive, exploitative systems. And it's the same with the native foods and botanicals. How do you do that ethically and with respect, and actually making sure you're maximising well-being and benefits for people themselves, not just to extract another profit to benefit the few. So it's really important work that you're doing. So tell me about the work that you're doing on your own country, which I'm not sure if I said it in the intro, but you're actually up near the Adani mine, the Carmichael mine in central Queensland. So what did you say? You're about 2.5 hours outside of Barcaldine, just to give people a sense of where you're beaming in from via satellite. What are you doing on your country?
So it's been many generations in the making, but we've managed to acquire now a 22,500 acre cattle property. And so part of that, so what's housed on this property, we have 7 springs, artesian springs. They're very important to us because we were rainmakers, and for our cultural ceremonies and practices around that. And so we also house potentially probably one of the most significant cultural heritage sites in all of Australia. It's been it's been a hidden treasure. And we're slowly walking towards that. And so that site, of course, goes for 250 metres long. So part of that then is then we know that there's the opportunity to develop tourism. But what is that tourism? We're more leaning towards a participatory experience. So come and observe our native, while we're wild harvesting for the native foods, or, you know, looking at everything that's left in situ here and how we're managing our land, how we actually share our stories around land management practices. But we also have been successful in a Queensland Government's land restoration fund as part of their pilot. So that's around carbon farming. So what we're doing is, so the land was cleared quite severely. And so the opportunity that's come for us is, I suppose, is to look at how we might do some of the grazing management. So we've minimalised the footprint of the cattle on the property. So it had a carrying capacity of around anywhere between 400 and 700 head of cattle. We're sitting at 230, but we'll reduce that herd, because it's also how you manage it with fire. And we know that because we've had quite a healthy rain season here, rainy season, so we've got lots of grass on the property. Some of us think it's since we've come back, you know, and the mob, and we believe that too, that the ancestors, because we are quite healthy with grass at the moment, which our neighbours and that aren't necessarily. So so then what we're needing to look at for fire management in that is we need to get the grass eaten down, because we haven't done the traditional burning off, you know, so there's savanna burning projects happening. So introducing our traditional land management practices through the cool burn off. So we'll start to look at that next year as we get, you know, back into the cooler months, and slowly as we manage and nurture the land back, because some of the stuff that we're also going to be observing is the plant species or the tree species that might come back because of, you know, and especially the Bohenia groves and those sorts of places, because this area all the way up through here was well known for the hairy-nosed wombat, for instance. And so we're also doing some ecological projects around bringing back the springs, so they'll all be brought back. So they're currently being used to water the paddocks, so we'll shut that down. So we're really looking at how we can develop best practice model and then share that with landholders out here in central Western Queensland. And I think it's really important, because if we hold this very sacred ancient knowledge of managing this land, then I think we need to be brave enough to start to lead, you know, in that practice. And I always believe we're better together, and we have a lot to share with landholders, so that perhaps then we can, you know, educate them in reducing their herd of sheep and cattle, that they can look at supplementary income streams, whether it's through native foods or, you know, carbon, you know, and so in particular, you know, the way we're approaching this whole property. So what we've, in this short period of time, like, we're also starting to investigate the harvesting of water. So we're looking at how we maybe even put in a water farm. And so from that, yeah, so this is something quite new that's come out. I think they're doing it down in Victoria. And it's just it's absolutely amazing. So that it's almost like these cells that are out like solar farms, basically, but it actually collects them and you produce water. So we're looking at that. Yeah, so if we start to look at especially the native foods or even with the cattle, so we're not then tapping into the artesian bore as well, although all our natural resources, because if we can cleverly harvest it now through these cellular systems, You know, so that's something else that we can, you know, that we're sort of excited that we've started to, and it's very new. And I think we're excited to have the opportunity to be a part of that, Amanda.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you. That's a really great introduction. We might get Carol and Thomas to jump back in because we've got some questions coming through. So while they're coming back, there was a question for you, Suzanne, about could you share a bit more about producing without water scenario? What did you mean by producing without water?
Oh, well, so a lot of our plant species that we have, especially out here, you know, so I think it had been a good 4 years before they had a decent rain when I'd gone out to the town common and had harvested. Now, I perhaps didn't get, if we still had a rainy season, I still wouldn't have got the production that we would have if we had rain, you know, the rain that we usually had through our cycles. But I think we can look at, and especially coming back to the water farming, but also look at the fact that, you know, how by nurturing the landscape that we have, and like how our people did, whether it's through the cool burn-offs or whether it's through the management of, you know, because I know that when there are certain trees and all sorts of things have fallen over, that they help to hold water. So I suppose for us, it was about how we practiced our land management practices. So we didn't just decide to, you know, because of that burn off, we didn't have wildfires that came through. So we didn't lose a lot of the debris and stuff like that that was lying around on the ground because it was nurtured, so it could still store water around those plants and things. So it's really, I think it's tapping into the ancient scientific knowledge, you know, and I think the landscape and how we as Aboriginal people are, it's I suppose country, it's our animals, and they're the ones that we learn from. If that's probably the easiest way.
Great, thank you. We've had a few questions about food waste, so I'm not sure if this is for you, Carol, or not, but there's sort of two parts to the question. So one question was on how do we convince more people to waste less food, whether from a climate or economic perspective, but also what are the most effective ways for managing food waste and even minimizing? Are there different systems for food or organic waste management that are more appropriate to match a preferable food system for appropriate recycling and reuse, etc., to suit those systems? So part of that question is from Erin Merrin, and the other one's from Leon Ross. So how do we?
They're great questions.
Yeah. Do you want to go,
Yeah.
Carol?
Yeah, sure. Well, the first part of that question about convincing people, I think it's a good question to ask, and we all have our part to play, thinking what we can do with the food waste from our kitchen. But we know that a lot of the food waste in the supply chain is not just from consumers. So there's a bit of politics going on here because it's in the interests of big business who create a lot of food waste to kind of say, oh, it's the consumers, we need to educate them. And I see that narrative a lot. And a lot of the responses are, you know, through some of the programs like RAP are all about consumer education, which is okay. That's one part of the system. But how do we educate Coles and Woolworths? You know, how do we educate big agribusiness? Because they're wasting food, but they're pushing the consequences off onto other people in the supply chain. So, for instance, it's known amongst farmers and some of the food industry, like the fruit and vegetable peak bodies, that quite often when they send a consignment to the major supermarket chains, it will get rejected at the back door of the distribution centre, and then they're invited to donate that to one of the food relief agencies. So they have little choice, because if you live 2,000 kilometers away from the distribution center and you've got refrigerated produce, you don't really want it back because you've got no market for it. So it's actually cheaper to give it away than to take it back and find a secondary market, you know, especially with the time aspects of that. So my response to that is, yeah, we do need to encourage people, and we do need to become more aware and think more about our food waste. But also we need to, again, it's that thing about doing what we can locally, but pushing that pressure up the supply chain. And it's really hard because it's not very visible either as well. So a lot of people don't realise this is where the food waste is actually coming from. What was the second part of that question? I'm sure I've completely forgotten already.
So it's how do you convince people, but also the ways of reducing food waste. I just want to add a really quick story to that because
Sure.
like it horrified me when because I come from far north Queensland and a veggie growing area, and I found out that a lot of farmers can't actually sell their second. Like I grew up on seconds, so all the food that was going to get rejected, like the potatoes that looked a bit weird, you can't buy them at the food gate anymore because of the contracts that are being signed with Coles and Woolies. But not only that, a friend of mine who is a potato farmer was telling me that she had to change the type of potato that they were growing, so completely change over their crop because that's what the contract with, I can't remember, was Coles or Woolies said. And then once it came time to harvest, it had a bumper crop down here in southeast Queensland. And so they were told, we don't need your potatoes anymore. And they were forced to dig them into the ground. They weren't allowed to sell them anywhere else. And it's like that kind of,
and that's
so
the consequence of market power.
When people say eat what's on your plate, it's like actually there's some bigger issues around the food waste that's got nothing to do with it.
Exactly. And that story is one that gets repeated all over Australia from fruit and vegetable growers. I've heard that's the same kind of thing time and time again. And it's because you've got the power concentrated. It's like an hourglass. If you think we've got hundreds or thousands of producers, thousands of consumers, and in the middle you've got your food being channeled through basically two big corporate retailers, gives them a lot of market power to dictate the terms. And that's what happens, and we need to hold them to account. But to do that, we actually need to know what they're doing and what their practices are. So hopefully this is just a little bit to poke at that system.
Yeah, great. And the other part of that question was, so when we've got food waste, how do we manage it? Well, what are the different ways that we can manage organic waste that's appropriate?
Gosh, well, I mean, I think there's all sorts of different systems for different types of waste. And again, this is something that's quite fragmented. So it depends what you're dealing with. But I think what we do need here is that leadership at the council level to say, OK, we're going to do curbside collection of food waste now. And then depending on what kind of systems that's most appropriate for that scale and volume and for that region, then communicate the types of food waste that can go into that system. So some will take meat and bread and those kinds of things, some kind of major composting systems. If you're doing the small backyard household composting, then you're just really looking at fresh fruit and vegetable scraps. So there's a potential to reuse and capture the value from a whole lot of food waste that we're not doing. But I think it's hard to have a definitive answer because it's so fragmented. I think that's again where we do need that leadership.
Great. I know in some places people are experimenting with biogas as well from organic waste as well. This might be a question for Thomas or for Suzanne, but it's a question about farming kangaroos for meat as a good way for regeneration, and I guess different to the sort of industrial meat production that we talk about with feedlots and then the problem with actually half of the food produced actually goes to livestock, not to humans. Thomas, did you want to start on that?
I was going to handball that one to Suzanne.
I was going to Thomas. You start and I'll come in.
Okay, well, I won't have much to contribute because I'm by no means an expert on the kangaroo meat industry. I'm aware that compared with other forms of meat production, kangaroo meat can be more sustainable. I'm also aware of some people that are very concerned about some of the, I guess, welfare implications of some of the culling practices. So it depends why people are wanting to reduce their meat or look for other forms of meat. Even with it being a potential solution for some people in some regions using some practices, it's not going to be able to feed Australia, let alone the world. And so I think we should be looking to eat less, and where we do still eat meat, for those people that choose to, they look to the most sustainable sources. Kangaroo may be one of them. I don't know. Suzanne, what are your thoughts?
No, look, absolutely. Well, I don't eat kangaroo because it's our totem. So, and that's another reason why I suppose when we think of, so learning from Indigenous people, not all of us ate roo, not all of us ate emu, and when we did, like I know, at the moment we're a bit excited and it's just this little window where we can get echidnas, and everybody go, oh no, but you didn't eat a lot of it, but it was for, for medicinal reasons, the elders, it was healthy. There was a whole reason with the goanna, with the, you'd get the goanna tail as an elder, and it was also the guana fat within that. And it was all of this stuff that balanced it out. But I think what it comes back to is minimizing the footprint of what we're talking about when it comes to meat. And I think that's the whole thing. It's not about get rid of it altogether, because when I think about, I look at some of the properties, and if they've got 4,000 head of cattle on there, you sort of go, but why? Or I know when we have, like, when it rains out here and our river runs and we can go out fishing, and you've got to wait, there's a little window, but it breaks your heart when people choose to go out there and put nets in, and get hundreds of fish you only need to focus on yourself and what you need to get for yourself, and so it's the same as, we were talking before about, growing, and I think, Carol, you'd mentioned it about growing your own food. It's as simple as that, is to be able to start to step up and take responsibility for our own personal survival, then looking at the big Coles and Woolies, and I think if we slowly, if as the grassroots movement starts to slow down that demand on big industry, then I think that will speak volumes. I think we can all learn from each other, but I don't necessarily believe that farming kangaroos is the way, because it's just introducing another meat, really. And, and yes, okay. But I also know that the methane, and I'd learned something the other day, I can't for the life of me think of whatever this plant is, but there's this new plant that's been found, and I know that there's an Indigenous group that are farming it. And so when the cattle eat it, it's a particular grass, it actually reduces, and so they don't release any methane. So, which is quite interesting. So there's all these little, like there's a lot of stuff in this space. Like I know, I was very fortunate to go to the Global Table Conference in Melbourne last week, the seeds and chips, and there's a whole nother level, a whole nother level of really understanding. And one of the messages out of that is we don't have till 2030 to get this right. We have less time. I'm fearful of what our summer's going to be like out here. If we were hitting 48 to 50 degrees out here, then I'll just end that. Sorry, out here, then, so what's this year going to bring for us, and how is the country going to survive with that, so yeah, so no, I don't think kangaroos. Sorry, it was a big long-winded answer, but I think that's probably nutshell, I think, Thomas.
Yeah, but you touched on something really important, because there's kind of an issue here. It's like, on one hand, you hear what Carol's saying around, there are so many really great grassroots initiatives from neighbourhood food co-ops and community gardens and people doing their own backyard gardening, and it stays very much on the fringe to a certain extent. And then you've got, the organics movement, like, really, on one hand, we need to change the system so that Coles and Woolies, it becomes business as usual to be, buying organic produce. So showing that market demand, and for the market demand for the sorts of things that Thomas is working on to get that mainstreamed. But at the same time, are we just propping up a system that is inherently flawed? Like you said, it's not just about farming kangaroos, because then it's still the same large-scale model that's creating problems. It'll just create different problems. So it's a thing that we keep getting back to, which is really quite tricky. Sorry, that was just a comment. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's worth acknowledging that there's no silver bullet solution to any of the challenges we're talking about, because we're talking about enormous problems on large-scale systems that are highly complex. And so there's no silver bullet. There are certainly a number of approaches that will be crucial, and whether that be going back to the way things used to be done in terms of more local or organic, smaller scale, not such a heavy monoculture type approach, that's one approach. Another is, let's look to new innovations and technologies and ways that we can farm foods and produce foods in a completely new way. Another is, how do we reduce the waste of the foods we're producing, regardless of which model of production they come out of? And I think all three of those streams are valid and very important. We're obviously operating in the second one, but yeah, you need initiatives and engagement and collaboration across that entire supply chain. Just to fill in one little gap, Suzanne, I think the product that you're referring to is a seaweed that has been tested by some scientists to try and reduce the methane production of cattle, which seems very promising. There are some pretty significant challenges there around, I mean, A, to grow the amount of seaweed required to feed number of cows would be quite a challenge, but also if you're grazing cattle, how do you deliver that product to them, particularly in those regions where it's very low stocking density? It works if it's a feedlot, but so again, there's no silver bullet. Maybe that could be a solution to reduce methane in a section of the cattle industry. Great. Let's look at other approaches as well.
Yeah, and really interestingly, the meat. Oh, sorry, Suzanne.
I was just going to say, and I've done a project a long time ago about ants, and so and it's quite interesting because I've noticed, so growing up out here, and I was sort of away for 25 years and come back, and there's areas that I know that there are way more ant mounds, termite ant mounds, than there used to be. The country is just getting more, and what it tells you as a landholder, especially for cattle, it's phosphorus deficient. And what we've looked at in that is but ants actually create a lot more methane, as I understand, so which is quite interesting. Yeah, and so if then we are not caring for country, and then all of a sudden we've got this huge influx of termite mounds, which they're just out of control, are we really so there's not, and there's not one solution. There's so many things out there, but ants are in one of those interesting spaces as well. Because they're just popping up everywhere. We've got, forests of ant mounds out here now. So
great. I'm going to
the
stress
other
about
thing too.
Yeah, you just added to my things of worry.
I know, and also Coles, because I know we've been talking about Coles and Woolworths, but I know that Coles, in particular, with Australian Native Foods and Botanicals, so they have a particular Indigenous fund, and so they're really looking at introducing and supporting the development and working with Indigenous communities so that Australian Native Foods can be a part of, so because what we want to see is that, wattle seed is just going to be as much popular, in the salt and pepper area, or and it'll become a commodity, because of the things and the different uses out of the wattle seed too, so there's a whole range of things that I know, the warrigal greens, people are starting to look at those, so there's a massive range, the potential of the Australian native rice as well, which is another big area,
Yeah, great. Well, there's probably just time for one last question. It's for you, Suzanne. The Adani mine is being opposed due to climate change. How will the mine affect the artesian basin and water supply for your crops and land if it goes ahead? From Susie Young is asking that question.
That's a very big question, and you've opened a can of worms up for me. I'll try and be very mindful about it.
You've got 3 minutes.
I've got people look. It potentially is going to, because one of the things that we're challenged with our biodiversity offsets that we're looking for under the carbon farming and stuff is the springs, and how we bring those springs back. That could impact on us, absolutely, because our springs are actually a part of the Dungabulla springs, which are the ones that the Adani mine are connecting into. But not only that, we need to look broader than that. And I promised myself I wouldn't bring this to the forefront, but one of the things that our council at the moment, and we seem to forget about water and how sacred water is, and water is one of those most sacred resources on the planet, most expensive resource on the planet, yet it's such a natural thing that falls from the sky, and so we're about in the process now. So not only have we got Adani out there, we've also got our council that started to dig a kilometre long, 400 metre wide hole to create a ski park, and going to be filling that ski park up from the artesian water. Unfortunately, they haven't got their water licence yet. We have a turfed racetrack that came in last year. That needs irrigating. So there are all these crazy things, yet landholders, and this is where I think a lot of the landholders, where they were up in arms about you know, Adani and the groundwater and the impacts that would have on the artesian basin is that they had to cap bores because of these continually flowing bores. Absolutely agree with that. But in turn, even if it was just the ability to irrigate a hectare of fodder to keep their cattle going, because one of the things that we know is that, you know, the bore drains, or especially our springs, and we've got a large amount of springs right throughout Bark-Alden area, which sort of sit up in the desert uplands area, which is part of those tectonics sort of plates and stuff like that. So, you know, so as they got blown up or, you know, changed, they disappeared. So the water stopped. And this is sort of, I suppose, for Indigenous people, that's what our belief is that we must look after these things. So the Adani mine, yes, it's going to impact on us greatly.
Great. Well, that's not the most positive note to end on. But if people want to learn more, so we've heard from Carol, but Thomas and Suzanne, do you have any suggestions if people want to learn more about what you've talked about, where they can go to find out more? We'll post the details of your organisations on the website, but any other ideas that came up as you were listening?
Well, our website is foodfrontier.org, and we have a number of resources on there, including a couple of recent reports. And so people are wanting to learn more about alternative proteins, that's a place they can start.
Great, thank you. And Suzanne?
Yeah, we've also got enfab.org.au, become a member. There's some various fact sheets in there around particular species of Australian native foods. And also, I just encourage people just to start to focus locally and foster great relationships with Indigenous people locally, because we are more than happy to share, you know, but there's going to be a few hurdles to get over, but we can only start through conversation.
Yeah, great. And I just want to have a shout out to, if you're interested in learning more and doing some cultural training, there's a really great group called Black Card. They're based in Brisbane, but they do training everywhere. But they also do tours of Brisbane and important sites, including food sites around Brisbane as well. Also, to let everyone know, again, if you don't know already, which you should, but on the 20th of September, so on Friday, is the climate strike. So get out there, there's strikes happening everywhere. So you've got no excuse not to join one. And it's not just the kids that are striking, it's actually, they've called out to everyone to join them on Friday afternoon. So find out where there's a strike near you. There's also an event happening that some people on the call might be interested in Melbourne at the National Gallery of Victoria on Tuesday night, that's being hosted by Latrobe Valley on the future of the climate movement. And we've got Bob Brown, David Ritter, who's the CEO of Greenpeace, Moesha Moyen, who's one of the school striker organisers in Melbourne, and myself talking about the future of the climate movement. So you can sign up there through the Latrobe University website. There's going to be lots happening this week, so get involved. Check out the 2040 website, because there's going to be more posted up there. And hopefully you join us in a month's time, where we'll be talking about waste, very specifically. What do we do about waste and the link with climate change? So please join us for that. Thank you, Carol, Suzanne and Thomas, for joining us on a Sunday afternoon. It's been great, and I'm sure there's going to be more discussion on the Facebook page after this. So thank you all. And hopefully we'll see you all. Great, and see everybody next time. All right, bye.
Bye.
And